The mountain air cuts sharp and clean through the Colorado darkness as you stand before the Stanley Hotel, its white colonial facade glowing ghostly pale against the ink-black silhouette of the Rocky Mountains. Even on a warm summer night, something about this place sends a chill down your spine, not from cold, but from an inexplicable sense that you are not alone, that hundreds of eyes from another realm are watching your approach. The building rises 4 stories into the star-scattered sky, its windows reflecting moonlight like dozens of unblinking eyes. This is the Stanley Hotel, perched at 7,500 feet above sea level in Estes Park, Colorado, and it has been watching over these mountains since 1909. To understand the Stanley Hotel's dark reputation, you must first understand that it was born from desperation and the specter of death itself. Freeland Oscar Stanley came to these mountains in 1903 as a dying man, his lungs ravaged by tuberculosis. He came expecting to take his final breaths in the clean mountain air, but instead experienced a miraculous recovery. Transformed by his brush with death, Stanley built a grand hotel to share this healing sanctuary with the world. What he created became something far more complex, a beautiful palace that would become home not just to the living seeking rejuvenation, but to spirits who refuse to leave. For over a century, guests have reported unexplainable phenomena within these walls. Phantom footsteps echoing through empty hallways, piano music playing from rooms where no one sits, doors opening and closing by invisible hands, and the feeling of being watched by eyes that belong to no living person. Continues this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe this channel. The Stanley Hotel, a tubercular dream in the thin mountain air. In the autumn of 1903, Freeland Oscar Stanley sat in his Massachusetts study, holding a death sentence written in the formal language of early 20th century medicine. The diagnosis was consumption tuberculosis, that merciless disease that had already claimed so many lives in America's industrial cities where coal smoke and factory dust turned human lungs into festering wounds. At 53 years old, this brilliant inventor and co-founder of the Stanley Motor Carriage Company had built an empire on steam-powered automobiles, but now his own body was betraying him. The physicians were blunt. His lungs were deteriorating, and the damp New England climate was hastening his demise. They gave him months, perhaps a year if he was fortunate. But F.O. Stanley was not a man who accepted defeat easily. And tuberculosis, he decided, would not write the final chapter of his story. The doctors prescribed what passed for treatment in that era, a change of climate, specifically the dry, thin air of the American West. Desperate and weakening, Stanley and his wife Flora boarded a train westward in the winter of 1903, seeking salvation in the mountains. They arrived in Estes Park, Colorado, a remote frontier settlement 7,000 feet above sea level, cradled in a valley beneath the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The town was hardly a town at all, just a scattering of rough cabins, a general store, and trappers' lodges accessible only by treacherous mountain roads. But the air was crystalline and sharp, so pure it seemed to cut through the lung tissue like a surgeon's knife, cauterizing the infection that was killing him. Within weeks, Stanley felt something he had not experienced in months. The ability to draw a full breath without pain. Within months, the impossible happened. He began to recover. As his health returned, Stanley fell deeply in love with this wild Colorado landscape. The massive rock formations, the pine forest stretching endlessly across mountainsides, the elk that wandered fearlessly through the meadows. It was a world utterly unlike the industrialized East, a primordial paradise where nature still reigned supreme. But Stanley, ever the entrepreneur, saw not just beauty but opportunity. Estes Park had saved his life, and he became convinced it could save others. Wealthy tuberculosis patients like himself desperately needed places like this, high-altitude sanctuaries where the disease could not survive. Yet Estes Park lacked the infrastructure to accommodate them. There were no proper hotels, no comfortable accommodations, no amenities befitting people of means and culture. The town could barely handle the handful of hunters and adventurers who stumbled through each summer. In 1907, Stanley made a decision that would change Estes Park forever. He would build a grand hotel here, a luxurious resort that would bring Eastern sophistication to the Western wilderness. It was an audacious plan bordering on madness. Estes Park was accessible only by rough wagon trails that became impassable in winter. There was no electricity, no running water infrastructure, no railway connection. Building materials would have to be hauled up mountain passes by horse and wagon. Labor would have to be imported. Every nail, every pane of glass, every stick of furniture would represent a logistical nightmare. But Stanley had conquered tuberculosis. Surely he could conquer the Rockies. He purchased 160 acres of land on a prominent hillside overlooking the valley, a site that commanded breathtaking views of Long's Peak, the highest mountain in the region. Then he set about addressing the fundamental problem: getting people here. With characteristic ingenuity, Stanley established a fleet of his Stanley steamer automobiles, those marvelous steam-powered cars he had helped perfect to transport guests from the Railhead and Lions up the harrowing mountain roads to Estes Park. These vehicles, capable of navigating terrain that defeated conventional automobiles, became famous for their reliability and comfort. Stanley himself often drove, his recovered health allowing him to pilot tourists up switchbacks and across creek fords with the skill of a mountain man. Construction began in 1907 and continued for 2 grueling years. Stanley imported Georgia pine for the hotel's distinctive colonial revival architecture, creating a gleaming white structure that seemed to float against the dark mountains behind it. He installed the town's first hydroelectric power plant, bringing electricity not just to his hotel, but eventually to the entire community. He ensured running water, steam heat, telephones, and every modern convenience available in 1909. The hotel would have 400 rooms across its main building and connected cottages, a grand lobby with a massive fireplace, a music room with a concert hall quality piano, and a billiard room for gentlemen. On July 4th, 1909, the Stanley Hotel opened its doors. It was a miracle of ambition and perseverance, a beacon of civilization perched on the edge of wilderness, built by a man who had faced death and refused to surrender. Stanley had come to Colorado to save his life, and in gratitude, he had given Colorado a monument to human resilience and possibility, a palace in the clouds where others might find the healing he had discovered in the thin mountain air. The Stanley Hotel gilded elegance at the edge of heaven. When the Stanley Hotel officially welcomed its first guests on that Independence Day in 1909, it was as though a piece of European grandeur had been airlifted from the Swiss Alps and set down in the Colorado Rockies. The gleaming white colonial revival building, with its distinctive red roof and elegant cupola, stood in magnificent contrast to the rugged wilderness surrounding it. This was no rustic mountain lodge where wealthy adventurers roughed it in frontier conditions. This was civilization at its most refined, a temple of luxury where America's elite could escape the summer heat and social pressures of eastern cities without sacrificing any comfort or sophistication. From the very beginning, F.O. Stanley had envisioned his creation as more than a hotel. It was to be a destination where high society could breathe mountain air while maintaining the standards of the finest establishments in New York, Boston, or London. The guest register in those early years read like a directory of American wealth and influence. Theodore Roosevelt, the former president and adventurer, stayed at the Stanley, finding in it a perfect balance between wilderness access and civilized comfort. The Vanderbilts, Morgans, and Rockefellers, families whose names define the Gilded Age, sent their relations to summer at the hotel, seeking relief from tuberculosis, nervous exhaustion, or simply the oppressive heat of eastern cities. Molly Brown, the unsinkable survivor of the Titanic disaster, became a regular visitor, charmed by the hotel's combination of Western informality and Eastern elegance. These were people accustomed to the finest hotels in Paris, London, and Rome, yet they found something unique at the Stanley. A grandeur that did not compete with nature, but complemented it. Enormous windows framing mountain vistas like living paintings. Stanley had spared no expense in creating an atmosphere of European sophistication. The main lobby featured a massive stone fireplace where guests gathered on cool evenings, the scent of burning pine mixing with expensive perfumes and cigar smoke. The music room housed a Steinway grand piano, and throughout the summer season, classical concerts filled the halls with Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms echoing off the mountain peaks outside. Stanley had hired a French chef from New York whose cuisine rivaled anything available in Denver or Colorado Springs. serving elaborate multi-course dinners with European wines in the grand dining room, where crystal chandeliers blazed with electric light. Still a novelty in 1909, especially in remote Colorado. The billiard room provided gentlemen with a masculine retreat of leather chairs, oak paneling, and bourbon, while the ladies' drawing room offered silk upholstery, afternoon tea services, and views of Long's Peak through floor-to-ceiling windows. The hotel staff reflected Stanley's commitment to excellence, trained in the European tradition of hospitality where service was an art form. Uniformed bellhops attended to every need, their crisp jackets and white gloves spotless despite the dusty mountain environment. The concierge could arrange anything from guided fishing expeditions into pristine mountain streams to private concerts in the music room. Chambermaids maintained the guest rooms to exacting standards, ensuring fresh linens daily, perfectly drawn curtains, and not a speck of dust on the ornate wooden furniture. The hotel operated on a philosophy that guests should want for nothing. Every whim anticipated, every comfort provided, every expectation exceeded. This was hospitality as theater, and every staff member played their role to perfection. Flora Stanley, F.O.'s wife, presided over the social aspects of the hotel with the grace of a European hostess. She organized elaborate garden parties on the manicured lawns, where guests in white linen suits and flowing dresses played croquet beneath the afternoon sun while a string quartet performed. She arranged evening galas in the grand ballroom, where society women in Paris gowns and glittering jewels waltzed with their husbands to live orchestras, the music drifting out through open windows into the pine-scented night. Flora understood that for the wealthy, a hotel was not merely lodging but a social stage, and she ensured the Stanley provided constant entertainment, stimulation, and opportunity for the kind of refined socializing that defined their class. The daily rhythm of life at the Stanley followed a genteel pattern that guests found both comforting and invigorating. Mornings began with breakfast served in rooms or in the sunny dining room, followed by outdoor activities, horseback riding through mountain meadows, fishing in icy streams, or gentle hikes along designated trails where the more adventurous could approach the wilderness without actually entering it. Afternoons meant returning to the hotel for elaborate luncheons, followed by rest periods when guests retired to their rooms or relaxed in the lobby with books and conversation. Evenings belonged to dressing for dinner, that nightly ritual where guests transformed themselves into their finest versions, then gathered for meals that lasted hours, followed by concerts, dances, or simply sitting on the wide veranda watching stars appear above mountain peaks, sipping brandy and discussing politics, business, and society, while somewhere in the darkened forest elk bugled their haunting calls into the gathering night. The Stanley Hotel, when lightning changed everything. On a June evening in 1911, just 2 years after the Stanley Hotel opened its gleaming doors to Colorado's mountain air and America's elite, housekeeper Elizabeth Wilson climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, carrying her chambermaid supplies and a small oil lamp to supplement the hotel's still novel electric lighting. Room 217 needed attention. Linens to be changed, surfaces to be dusted, the kind of meticulous work that kept the Stanley's reputation spotless among its demanding clientele. Elizabeth was a conscientious employee, known for her thoroughness and reliability, exactly the kind of staff member F.O. Stanley prized. She entered the room as she had hundreds of times before, unaware that the next few seconds would transform her life, the hotel's history, and eventually contribute to one of the most enduring ghost stories in American hospitality. The room was quiet, elegant in its appointments, with large windows overlooking the mountain vista that made the Stanley famous. Elizabeth set down her supplies and reached to light the room's gas lanterns, because despite the hotel's advanced electrical system, gas lighting remained as backup throughout the building, a safety measure that on this particular evening would prove catastrophically ironic. What Elizabeth could not have known was that a gas leak had been slowly filling room 217 with invisible, odorless fuel throughout the day. Perhaps a valve had been improperly closed, or a seal had degraded in the high-altitude environment, or some combination of circumstances had created the perfect conditions for disaster. When she struck a match to light the lantern, the accumulated gas ignited instantaneously. The explosion was tremendous, a roaring fireball that blew out the room's large windows, shattered the door frame and sent chunks of plaster, wood, and glass cascading into the hallway and onto the lawn below. The blast was heard throughout the hotel and in downtown Estes Park, a thunderous boom that brought staff and guests running in panic, convinced that lightning had struck the building or that some terrible accident had befallen the gleaming palace on the hill. Smoke poured from the second-floor windows as people shouted and scattered, the acrid smell of burning gas and scorched wood filling the mountain air. When rescuers reached room 217, they expected to find Elizabeth Wilson's broken body amid the wreckage. The room was devastated. Furniture overturned and splintered, wallpaper blackened, the elegant appointments reduced to smoking debris. But miraculously and possibly, Elizabeth was alive. The explosion had blown a hole clean through the floor, and she had fallen through into the room below, landing in a tangle of shattered floorboards, plaster dust, and fabric. Her ankles were severely injured, fractured by the impact, and she was burned and bruised, covered in debris and blood, but she was breathing, conscious, and would survive. F.O. Stanley himself rushed to her side, overwhelmed with relief and guilt that his magnificent hotel had nearly killed one of his most trusted employees. He ensured she received the finest medical care available, paid all her expenses, and when she recovered months later, he personally guaranteed her a job at the Stanley for as long as she wanted it, a promise the hotel honored for the rest of her working life. The explosion left room 217 in ruins, but Stanley immediately ordered repairs, determined that this incident would not tarnish his hotel's reputation or create a permanent scar on the building. Workers rebuilt the room meticulously, replacing the damaged floor, replastering walls, installing new windows, and refurbishing it to the same elegant standard as every other accommodation. Within months, room 217 was accepting guests again, and the explosion became a curious footnote in the hotel's early history. A dramatic story to tell at dinner parties, but nothing that seemed to have lasting consequences. Yet almost immediately after the room reopened, strange reports began filtering through the staff quarters and whispered among guests. Suitcases that had been carefully unpacked would be found neatly repacked by morning. Clothing laid out on beds would be folded and put away by invisible hands. Lights that guests turned off would be found burning when they returned. Most peculiarly, several guests reported waking in the night to find a spectral woman standing at the foot of their bed, dressed in the long skirt and high-collared blouse of an Edwardian housekeeper, her face obscured by shadow, simply standing there watching them before vanishing like morning mist. The descriptions were remarkably consistent, always a woman, always dressed as hotel staff from the 1910s, always performing housekeeping duties or standing guard as though checking on guests' welfare. Some visitors found the presence comforting, as though being looked after by an invisible chambermaid. Others were terrified, fleeing the room in the middle of the night and demanding different accommodations. The staff began to whisper that it was Elizabeth Wilson, that somehow the trauma of the explosion had bound her spirit to room 217, that she had died in that blast and returned, or that she had survived but left something of herself behind in that moment of fire and terror. Elizabeth herself, still working at the hotel, would neither confirm nor deny the stories, maintaining a dignified silence about the explosion and its aftermath, though some staff members claimed she would never enter room 217 again, always finding excuses to assign it to other housekeepers, as though she knew something waited there that she preferred not to confront. The Stanley Hotel, when the spirits began to stir. In the years following the room 217 explosion, the Stanley Hotel continued to flourish as a crown jewel of Colorado hospitality, its reputation for luxury and European elegance drawing wealthy guests from across America. But alongside the stories of spectacular mountain views and impeccable service, another kind of tale began circulating, whispered at first in staff quarters and dismissed as imagination or nerves, but gradually becoming impossible to ignore. The hotel, it seemed, had acquired invisible residents who moved through its elegant corridors with purposes of their own, indifferent to the living guests who paid handsomely for their rooms. These phenomena were not violent or malevolent, but they were persistent, and they followed patterns that became eerily familiar to anyone who spent significant time within the Stanley's white walls. The footsteps began almost immediately after the hotel's opening, Though initially staff dismissed them as sounds traveling strangely through the building's wooden construction, or echoes from guests moving through distant hallways, but the footsteps heard on the grand staircase defied such rational explanations. Night staff working late shifts reported hearing the distinctive sound of a woman's shoes, the hard-heeled boots fashionable in that era, climbing the stairs from the lobby to the second floor, the rhythm steady and purposeful, exactly the sound a guest or staff member would make ascending to their room. Security guards would rush to investigate, expecting to find a lost guest or an employee working late, but the staircase would be empty, bathed in shadows from the electric sconces, utterly devoid of any living person. The footsteps would stop abruptly at the second-floor landing, as though whoever climbed the stairs had simply vanished into the wallpaper. Some guards claimed to hear the footsteps continuing down the second-floor hallway toward the wing that housed room 217. But when they followed, they found only locked doors and darkness, the thick carpet showing no disturbance, no evidence that anyone had passed. More disturbing were the incidents in the music room, that elegant space where Flora Stanley had hosted so many refined gatherings, and where the magnificent Steinway grand piano served as centerpiece for concerts that had entertained the likes of Vanderbilts and Rockefellers. Staff closing the hotel for the night began reporting that they could hear piano music drifting through the building long after all guests had retired and the music room had been locked. The melodies were always classical. Beethoven sonatas, Chopin nocturnes, the kind of sophisticated compositions that Flora herself favored, played with professional skill and expression. Security personnel investigating these nocturnal concerts would find the music room dark and empty. The piano closed, its keys untouched, yet the music would continue playing from somewhere, seemingly emanating from the instrument itself or from the very air around it. On several occasions, guards reported opening the music room door while music was clearly audible, only to have it stop the instant the door swung wide, as though the invisible pianist had been interrupted mid-performance and chosen to cease playing rather than be observed. The doors presented perhaps the most persistent and unsettling phenomenon, because unlike footsteps or phantom music, which could theoretically be explained as acoustic anomalies or auditory hallucinations, the doors moved physically in ways that multiple witnesses could verify. Guest room doors that had been securely locked from the inside would be found standing wide open in the morning, despite occupants swearing they had checked the locks before sleeping. Staff members working in guest rooms would leave briefly to fetch supplies, carefully closing doors behind them, only to return and find doors open again, sometimes swinging slowly on their hinges as though someone had just passed through. The phenomenon was particularly pronounced on the second floor, especially near room 217, where housekeepers reported an almost playful quality to the door openings. They would close a linen closet door, turn to fetch fresh towels, and hear the distinct click of the door opening again behind them over and over, as though some invisible presence was testing them, or perhaps trying to communicate through the only means available. Flora Stanley herself experienced the piano phenomenon multiple times, and unlike others who might have been frightened, she seemed almost pleased by it, telling friends that she believed the spirit was simply another music lover appreciating the beautiful instrument and the acoustics of the room. She sometimes left the music room unlocked at night, saying that if a ghost wished to play piano, she saw no reason to deny them the pleasure. F.O. Stanley took a more skeptical view, suggesting that mountain winds, temperature changes, and the building settling could explain most phenomena, but even he could not account for reports from multiple reliable witnesses who described identical experiences, the footsteps always climbing the same stairs at the same measured pace, the piano always playing the same areas of the hotel. Staff members developed unofficial protocols for dealing with these occurrences, speaking to the empty hallways as they closed doors or silenced phantom music, asking politely for the spirits to rest, to leave the living to their work, though whether these requests had any effect remained unclear. What was certain was that the Stanley Hotel had become home to something beyond its wealthy guests and dedicated staff, something that moved through its elegant spaces with the confidence of ownership, as though the hotel belonged to them as much as to F.O. Stanley and his paying visitors. The Stanley Hotel, the night that birthed the nightmare. In late September of 1974, a struggling writer named Stephen King and his wife Tabitha drove their battered car up the winding mountain roads to Estes Park, desperately seeking a night's rest during a meandering road trip through Colorado. King had published his first novel, Carrie, earlier that year, but literary success remained elusive and uncertain. He was still teaching high school English, still scraping by financially, still wondering if he could make a living from the horror stories that consumed his imagination. They arrived at the Stanley Hotel just as the summer season was ending, that transitional moment in late autumn when mountain resorts begin shutting down for winter, when staff dwindles and the wealthy guests who filled the halls all summer have returned to their eastern cities. The timing could not have been more perfect, though King did not know it yet. The Stanley's manager, needing to fill rooms during the slow season, quoted them a remarkably low rate, just enough to make the splurge justifiable, and the Kings checked in, unaware they were about to spend a night that would transform American horror literature and cement the Stanley's reputation as one of the most haunted hotels in the world. The hotel was nearly empty, perhaps the only guests in the entire vast building, and this emptiness created an atmosphere of isolation that King found simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling. The grand lobby, designed to accommodate hundreds of wealthy socialites, echoed with their footsteps. The long corridors stretched into shadows, their elegant wallpaper and ornate sconces creating pockets of light and darkness that seemed to shift as they walked past. The hotel staff was skeletal, just a handful of employees preparing to close the property for winter, their movements through the building creating distant sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. King felt the weight of the building's history pressing down on him. 65 years of guests and staff, births and deaths, celebrations and tragedies, all absorbed into the wood and plaster-like memories soaked into fabric. After checking in, King and Tabitha explored the hotel, wandering through deserted ballrooms where ghostly orchestras might have played, past closed dining rooms where tables sat empty and perfectly set, through hallways lined with doors that could have concealed anything or nothing behind their identical wooden facades. That evening, they discovered to their surprise that the hotel's grand dining room was still operating despite having only 2 guests, and they sat down to dinner in that vast, elegant space, served by attentive waiters in a room designed for hundreds but occupied only by them. King ordered steak and several drinks, trying to shake the peculiar feeling the hotel had instilled in him, that sense of being watched by invisible eyes, of walking through a place where the boundaries between past and present had worn dangerously thin. After dinner, Tabitha retired to their room, room 217, the very room where Elizabeth Wilson had survived the gas explosion 63 years earlier, though King did not know this detail at the time. While Stephen decided to explore the hotel alone, he wandered down to the Colorado bar, ordered a drink, and sat in the empty lounge, the only customer being served by a solitary bartender. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the clink of ice in his glass and the distant sounds of the building settling, creaking, breathing like a living thing around him. Later, King returned to room 217, walking through corridors that seemed to extend forever, past numbered doors that could have hidden anything, empty rooms, sleeping strangers, or something else entirely. The hotel felt like a maze, a labyrinth of identical hallways where a man could lose himself and never be found. When he entered the room, Tabitha was already asleep and King prepared for bed. But sleep would not come. He lay awake in the darkness, listening to the hotel's nighttime symphony. Footsteps in hallways that should have been empty, distant sounds of doors opening and closing, the building's wood and metal expanding and contracting in the mountain cold, creating groans and whispers that sounded almost like voices. And then, somewhere in the building, King heard what sounded like a child laughing or perhaps crying, a high, thin sound that echoed through ventilation shafts or slipped under doorways impossible to locate but unmistakably present. In that sleepless darkness, with his imagination inflamed by alcohol, isolation, and the hotel's oppressive atmosphere, King began to dream awake. He envisioned a family trapped in this enormous hotel during winter, snowed in with no escape, the building's isolation and history slowly driving the father mad. He saw a small boy riding a tricycle through endless corridors, a woman hiding in a bathroom, a man stalking his family with murder in his eyes, and the hotel itself as a malevolent presence feeding on human souls like a vampire feeds on blood. The vision was so powerful, so complete, that King got out of bed, found paper, and began making notes in the darkness, not wanting to lose the details flooding his mind. By morning, when pale sunlight filtered through room 217's windows and revealed the elegant furnishings and mountain views, King had the entire outline of The Shining mapped out. Characters, plot, themes, everything born from one terrifying night in the Stanley Hotel. They checked out after breakfast, King barely speaking, his mind churning with the story demanding to be written, and drove away from the white building on the hill, leaving behind the ghosts that had given him his greatest novel, but taking with them something of the hotel's darkness, a seed of terror that would blossom into one of the most influential horror stories ever written, The Stanley Hotel, where truth and fiction diverge. When Stephen King published The Shining in 1977, readers immediately recognized the Stanley Hotel as the inspiration for the Overlook Hotel, that malevolent mountain resort where the Torrance family's nightmare unfolded. But King had transformed his one-night experience into something far darker and more twisted than the Stanleys' actual history, taking the hotel's elegant bones and wrapping them in supernatural horror that bore only superficial resemblance to reality. The confusion deepened in 1980 when Stanley Kubrick's film adaptation hit theaters, because Kubrick had not filmed at the Stanley at all. He shot exterior scenes at the Timberline Lodge in Oregon and built elaborate interior sets in England, creating a completely fictional hotel that looked nothing like the white colonial revival building in Estes Park. This double transformation, King's literary adaptation, and then Kubrick's cinematic reimagining, created layers of fiction that increasingly obscured the real Stanley Hotel, until many people could no longer distinguish between what had actually happened in Colorado and what had been invented for books and films. The most fundamental difference lay in the hotel's essential natures. The Overlook Hotel in King's novel was built on an Indian burial ground, and had a history soaked in blood, murders, suicides, mob violence, and corruption stretching back to its construction. Every detail of the Overlook's past dripped with malevolence, suggesting that evil had been woven into the building's foundation from the very beginning, that the hotel itself was a kind of supernatural predator that fed on human suffering and madness. The real Stanley Hotel had no such dark origins. F.O. Stanley built it as a health resort motivated by gratitude for his own recovery from tuberculosis and a desire to share the healing mountain air with others. There were no Indian burial grounds beneath its foundation, no history of mob ownership or violent deaths during construction. The Stanleys' early years were characterized by sophistication and healing, not horror. It was a place where wealthy invalids recovered their health, where high society gathered for elegant parties, where classical music filled summer evenings, and the greatest danger was perhaps boredom or altitude sickness. The famous Room 217 incident illustrated how King transformed reality into fiction. In the novel and film, the room becomes a locus of supernatural evil, housing the ghost of a woman who died violently in a bathtub, her decomposing corpse rising to attack the protagonist in one of horror literature's most disturbing scenes. The real Room 217's history, while dramatic, was entirely different. Elizabeth Wilson survived the gas explosion. She did not die in the room. There was no bathtub death, no violent ghost haunting the space. Paranormal activity reported in Room 217 over the decades consisted mainly of housekeeping phenomena. Repacked suitcases, folded clothes, flickering lights, suggesting a helpful rather than malevolent presence, as though Elizabeth's spirit, if it existed at all, was simply continuing her meticulous work as a chambermaid. Guests who stayed in Room 217 after the explosion rarely reported terror. Instead, they described feeling watched over, protected, as though an invisible housekeeper was ensuring their comfort and safety. King's novel featured horrific events that had no parallel in Stanley Hotel history. The previous caretaker murdering his family with an axe, the July 4th ball where ghosts in 1920s attire danced and drank in a spectral recreation of the hotel's glory days, the topiary animals that came to life and stalked the grounds, the fire hose that transformed into a snake. None of these elements had any basis in reports from the Stanley. The real hotel's paranormal activity, as reported by staff and guests over decades, was remarkably benign. Footsteps on stairs, piano music in the music room, doors opening and closing, occasional apparitions of well-dressed figures from the early 20th century. There were no reports of homicidal ghosts, no supernatural attacks, no manifestations of pure evil trying to possess or destroy the living. The Stanleys' ghosts, if they existed, seemed content to coexist peacefully with the hotel's operations, perhaps even enhancing its reputation and attracting curious visitors. Kubrick's film added another layer of distortion by changing the setting entirely. The Timberline Lodge in Oregon, with its massive stone construction and isolated mountain location, looked nothing like the Stanley's white colonial revival elegance. Kubrick's interior sets created a maze-like hotel with impossible geometry, contradictory spatial relationships, and oppressive Art Deco aesthetic that bore no resemblance to the Stanley's Bright. The famous hedge maze that features prominently in the film's climax did not exist at the Stanley FO. Stanley had planted formal gardens and maintained manicured lawns, but there was no labyrinth where a man could chase his son through frozen corridors of vegetation. The Gold Room, where Jack Torrance encounters the ghostly bartender Lloyd, was pure invention. The Stanley had a Colorado bar, but it was a modest lounge, not the grand Art Deco ballroom Kubrick created. Perhaps most significantly, the Stanley Hotel never closed for winter, never trapped anyone in snowbound isolation. The hotel did reduce operations during cold months, but Estes Park remained accessible year-round, and staff always maintained the property. The central premise of The Shining, a family utterly isolated in a massive hotel, cut off from civilization by impassable snow, could not have happened at the Stanley. This fundamental plot point was pure fiction invented by King to create the claustrophobic horror his story required. The real Stanley Hotel remained connected to the world, its ghosts coexisting with guests and staff in an arrangement that had endured for decades, mysterious perhaps, but never truly dangerous. A haunted hotel where the spirits seemed as interested in preserving the building's elegant legacy as the living owners who maintained it. The Stanley Hotel, where ghosts choose their chambers. Over the decades following Elizabeth Wilson's explosive encounter in room 217, the Stanley Hotel developed a reputation for having specific rooms where paranormal activity concentrated with remarkable consistency, as though the building's spirits had claimed particular territories and returned to them repeatedly, year after year, guest after guest. These rooms became legendary among paranormal enthusiasts and curious travelers, each with its own distinctive phenomena and its own dark folklore. Room 217 remained the most famous, of course, forever marked by the 1911 gas explosion and the countless strange occurrences reported there since. Guests checking into 217 frequently experienced the sensation of being tucked into bed by invisible hands. The covers pulled up gently around their shoulders as they drifted toward sleep, a motherly gesture that suggested Elizabeth Wilson had never stopped caring for those under her watch. Men staying in the room reported waking to find their luggage unpacked and clothing neatly arranged in drawers and closets, despite having left everything in suitcases the night before. Elizabeth's fastidious housekeeping apparently extending beyond death. Some guests found this comforting, even charming, but others fled the room in terror after waking to see a shadowy female figure standing at the foot of the bed, silhouetted against the window, watching them with what felt like protective concern or perhaps judgment about the state of their belongings. But room 217 was not the only chamber where the veil between worlds seemed dangerously thin. The fourth floor of the Stanley Hotel developed an especially sinister reputation, particularly rooms 401, 407, and 428, where guests and staff reported phenomena far more disturbing than Elizabeth Wilson's helpful housekeeping. Room 401 became notorious for strange occurrences involving children, despite the room being occupied by adults. Guests staying in 401 reported hearing the distinct sounds of children playing in the hallway outside their door. High-pitched laughter, running footsteps, the rolling of a ball or toy across the wooden floors. Sounds that would continue for hours in the middle of the night. When guests opened the door to investigate or complain, they found the hallway empty and silent. No sign of children or anyone else. The thick carpet showing no disturbance. More disturbing were reports from guests who claimed to wake and see the figures of two young children standing in their room. A boy and a girl dressed in old-fashioned clothing from the early 1900s, holding hands and staring at the sleeping adults with expressions that witnesses described as both innocent and deeply unsettling. The children would remain visible for several seconds before fading away like morning fog, leaving guests wondering if they had actually seen spirits or merely experienced vivid dreams induced by the hotel's reputation and the thin mountain air. Room 428 presented different but equally chilling phenomena. This corner room seemed to be a focal point for male spirits, perhaps former guests or staff from the hotel's early decades. Men staying in room 428 frequently reported feeling an aggressive presence as though another man was in the room with them, competing for territory or expressing anger at the intrusion. Some described waking to feel the sensation of hands pressing down on their chests making breathing difficult, or of being watched by hostile eyes from the room's dark corners. Women staying in the room occasionally reported seeing the apparition of a well-dressed man in early 20th century clothing. Suit, vest, pocket watch, standing near the window or sitting in the room's chair, smoking a cigar that produced no actual smoke but filled the room with a distinct smell of tobacco. This figure never spoke or interacted directly with witnesses, but seemed to be waiting for something or someone, his presence suggesting unfinished business that kept him tethered to this particular room in this particular hotel. Room 47, located in the same fourth-floor corridor, became known for auditory phenomena that defied explanation. Guests staying in this room reported hearing parties in the hallway throughout the night, the sounds of multiple people talking, laughing, glasses clinking, music playing, as though a grand celebration was taking place just outside their door. The sounds were so convincing that many guests called the front desk to complain about the noise, only to be told that no other rooms on the floor were occupied and no parties or events were scheduled. Security personnel sent to investigate would find the fourth-floor hallway dark, empty, and completely silent. Yet guests in room 407 insisted the party sounds continued, sometimes until dawn when they would gradually fade away like a radio being slowly turned down. Some paranormal investigators theorized that room 407 served as a kind of acoustic window into the hotel's past. The guests in this room were somehow hearing echoes of actual parties and gatherings that had taken place decades earlier. The building structure somehow recording and replaying these moments of celebration like a supernatural recording device. What made these haunted rooms particularly fascinating was the consistency of reports across decades and across different types of guests, skeptics and believers, families and solo travelers, people who knew the hotel's haunted reputation, and those who had no idea, all describing remarkably similar experiences in the same rooms. The phenomena seemed independent of the guests' expectations or beliefs, suggesting that something genuine was occurring, whether psychological, environmental, or truly supernatural. The Stanley Hotel management eventually embraced these stories, making the haunted rooms a selling point rather than a shameful secret, allowing guests to specifically request room 217 or the fourth-floor rooms if they wanted a potentially paranormal experience, turning the Stanley's ghosts into amenities as valuable as the mountain views and elegant dining. The Stanley Hotel, the founder who never left. Freeland Oscar Stanley died in 1940 at the age of 91. His remarkable life spanning from the Civil War era into the age of automobiles and electricity, a journey from steam-powered carriages to the brink of World War II. He had beaten tuberculosis against all medical odds, built a luxury hotel in the Colorado wilderness when everyone said it was impossible, brought electricity and automobiles to a frontier town, and created an enduring monument to human ambition and resilience. But if the countless reports from staff and guests over the subsequent decades are to be believed, death did not mark the end of F.O. Stanley's relationship with the hotel that bore his name. Instead, it seemed merely to change the nature of his occupancy, transforming him from living proprietor to spectral guardian, a presence that continued to move through the building's elegant corridors with the same purposeful authority he had exercised in life. The sightings began almost immediately after his death, and they followed patterns so consistent, so detailed, and so characteristic of Stanley's actual personality and habits that dismissing them as mere imagination became increasingly difficult for those who experienced them firsthand. The most frequent reports came from the billiard room and the main lobby, two spaces where F.O. Stanley had spent countless hours during his life, conducting business, entertaining guests, and overseeing his creation with the meticulous attention to detail that had made the Stanley Hotel successful. Staff working night shifts in the lobby described seeing a tall, distinguished gentleman in old-fashioned clothing, a dark suit, vest, and bow tie of the style popular in the 1920s and 1930s, standing near the grand staircase or the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of contemplation or assessment, as though he were examining the lobby's condition and finding it either satisfactory or wanting. The figure would remain visible for several seconds, solid and three-dimensional enough that witnesses initially assumed he was an eccentric guest wearing vintage clothing. But when approached or addressed, the figure would simply vanish, not fading gradually but disappearing instantaneously, as though he had never been there at all. Security guards reviewing footage from the lobby's surveillance cameras during periods when the apparition was reported visible found nothing on the recordings. The cameras showed empty lobby space exactly where multiple witnesses insisted they had seen F.O. Stanley's ghost standing. In the billiard room, the phenomena took a more interactive form. This masculine space, with its dark wood paneling, leather furniture, and elegant billiard table, had been one of F.O. Stanley's favorite retreats, a place where he had entertained business associates and wealthy guests, discussing investments and innovations while playing casual games of pool. Maintenance staff and night security reported finding the billiard balls arranged on the table in the morning in patterns that suggested a game had been played overnight, despite the room being locked and empty. On several occasions, staff entering the billiard room heard the distinct sounds of balls clicking together, the crack of a cue stick making contact, and the rolling thunder of balls moving across the felt surface. Yet when they turned on the lights, the table would be empty and the balls would be racked in their triangle as they had been left the previous evening. More dramatically, some witnesses reported seeing a translucent figure leaning over the billiard table, cue stick in hand, lining up a shot with the concentration of an expert player, the figure's features unmistakably those of F.O. Stanley, as he appeared in his later years, the distinctive mustache, the erect posture, the intense focus that characterized his approach to everything he undertook. What made these sightings particularly compelling was their consistency with Stanley's known personality and habits. The apparition never appeared angry or threatening, never engaged in the kind of malevolent behavior associated with traditional ghost stories. Instead, witnesses described a presence that seemed proprietary and protective, as though F.O. Stanley was making his rounds, checking on his hotel, ensuring that standards were being maintained and that his creation was being properly cared for. Some staff members reported feeling watched while performing their duties, not in a threatening way, but in the manner of a strict but fair supervisor observing their work. And several housekeepers claimed they worked more carefully and thoroughly when they felt F.O. Stanley's presence nearby, as though his invisible scrutiny demanded their best efforts. This protective quality extended to the hotel's physical structure. Maintenance workers sometimes reported experiencing an inexplicable compulsion to check certain areas of the building, only to discover developing problems like water leaks or electrical issues that would have caused serious damage if left unaddressed, as though Stanley's ghost was directing them to areas needing attention. Flora Stanley, F.O.'s beloved wife, who had died in 1939, just a year before her husband, also reportedly manifested in the hotel, though her appearances were confined almost exclusively to the music room where she had hosted so many elegant gatherings during the hotel's glory years. Staff and guests reported hearing the distinctive sound of the Steinway grand piano being played expertly in the middle of the night. Always classical compositions of the type Flora had favored. Chopin, Beethoven, Mozart performed with the skill and interpretation of a trained musician. On rare occasions, witnesses entering the music room during these nocturnal concerts reported seeing a translucent female figure seated at the piano, her hands moving over the keys with practiced grace, her posture perfect, dressed in the long gowns and elaborate hairstyles of the Edwardian era. Unlike F.O., Ghost, which seemed concerned with the hotel's physical maintenance and business operations, Flora's spirit appeared focused entirely on music and beauty, as though she was continuing in death the cultural refinement she had brought to the Stanleyan life. Her performance is a kind of eternal contribution to the hotel's atmosphere of elegance and sophistication that transcended the boundaries between the living and the dead. The Stanley Hotel, when science met the supernatural. By the 1990s, the Stanley Hotel had embraced its haunted reputation so completely that management began actively inviting paranormal investigation teams to conduct formal studies of the building, transforming the elegant resort into what became one of the most thoroughly documented haunted locations in America. These were not casual ghost tours or publicity stunts, but serious investigations conducted by experienced researchers using sophisticated equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, digital thermometers, infrared cameras, audio recorders sensitive enough to capture sounds beyond human hearing range, and motion sensors that could detect movement invisible to the naked eye. What these investigators discovered over hundreds of hours of documentation defied easy explanation and provided some of the most compelling evidence ever recorded that something genuinely anomalous was occurring within the Stanley's white walls. Phenomena that could not be dismissed as imagination suggestion, or the creaking of an old building settling in the mountain cold. The most dramatic findings came from electronic voice phenomenon recordings, or EVP, a technique where investigators asked questions aloud in empty rooms and then analyzed audio recordings for responses that had not been audible during the actual investigation. In room 217, multiple investigation teams recorded what appeared to be a woman's voice responding to questions, the words emerging from silence on the recordings despite no living person being present when the questions were asked. When investigators asked, "Is Elizabeth Wilson here with us?" several recordings captured what sounded like a faint but distinct yes or "I'm here," the voice feminine and carrying an accent consistent with early 20th century American speech patterns. More chillingly, when investigators in the same room asked, "Do you remember the explosion?" one recording captured what analysis suggested was a sharp intake of breath followed by words that sounded like "the fire" or "it burned," spoken in a tone that conveyed lingering fear or trauma. Audio analysts who examined these recordings confirmed that the voices were not artifacts of radio interference, electronic noise, or audio pareidolia, where the brain interprets random sounds as speech. These were actual vocalizations captured on the recordings that had not been present in the room at the time of recording, suggesting some form of communication from sources that produced no sound waves detectable by human ears, but somehow impressed themselves onto electronic recording media. Electromagnetic field measurements throughout the hotel revealed patterns that paranormal investigators found highly significant. Baseline EMF readings in most areas of the Stanley registered normal levels consistent with the building's electrical wiring and appliances. But certain locations, particularly room 217, the billiard room, the music room, and specific spots in the fourth-floor hallway, showed dramatic spikes in electromagnetic activity that appeared and disappeared without correlation to any electrical source. These spikes would surge from normal background levels to readings 10 or 20 times higher, hold for several seconds or minutes, then drop back to baseline as though some invisible presence was generating its own electromagnetic field. What made these readings particularly intriguing was that they often coincided with other phenomena. Investigators would detect an EMF spike and simultaneously experience temperature drops, hear unexplained sounds, or capture anomalous images on camera. Some researchers theorized that whatever spirits haunted the Stanley were somehow composed of or generated electromagnetic energy, that the EMF spikes represented the actual presence of the entities, their manifestation into our physical reality creating detectable disturbances in the local electromagnetic environment. Infrared and full-spectrum camera footage captured visual anomalies that remained unexplained despite extensive analysis. In the music room, multiple investigation teams recorded footage showing what appeared to be a luminous, vaguely humanoid form materializing near the piano, visible only in infrared wavelengths and visible to human eyes but clearly present on camera, a glowing shape approximately the size and proportions of an adult human, sometimes appearing to sit at the piano bench, other times standing beside the instrument, always present during periods when investigators or hotel staff reported hearing phantom piano music. The fourth-floor hallway yielded footage of shadow figures, dark, human-shaped silhouettes moving through the corridor despite no physical person being present, the shadows cast without any light source that could explain them, moving with purposeful direction as though they were people walking to specific destinations. Frame-by-frame analysis of these recordings showed the shadows had depth and substance. They interacted with the environment by appearing to open doors or pause at room entrances, and they moved in ways inconsistent with tricks of light or camera artifacts. Temperature anomalies presented some of the most unsettling evidence. Investigators using thermal imaging cameras and digital thermometers documented sudden, localized temperature drops of 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, occurring in confined areas no larger than a few cubic feet, while surrounding areas maintained normal temperature. These cold spots would appear suddenly, remain stable for several minutes, then dissipate, often moving through rooms as though something invisible and intensely cold was walking from one location to another. In room 401, where child spirits were frequently reported, investigators captured thermal footage showing two small cold spots, roughly 3 to 4 feet tall, positioned side by side in the center of the room, proportions consistent with two children standing together, while the rest of the room registered normal temperature. The cold spots remained visible on thermal imaging for nearly 10 minutes, occasionally moving slightly as though the children were shifting their weight or turning to look around, before suddenly vanishing without the gradual temperature equalization that would occur with natural causes like air conditioning or drafts. Perhaps most compelling were instances where multiple types of evidence coincided. Investigators in the billiard room simultaneously recording EVP responses to their questions, detecting massive EMF spikes, capturing shadow figures on infrared camera, and experiencing dramatic temperature drops, all while several team members reported feeling watched or sensing a presence in the room. These convergent phenomena, documented by multiple instruments and multiple witnesses, created evidential chains that researchers found extraordinarily difficult to explain through conventional means, suggesting that whatever haunted the Stanley Hotel possessed sufficient substance and energy to affect multiple detection systems simultaneously. Manifestations powerful enough to bridge the gap between the invisible spirit world and the measurable physical reality that scientific instruments could quantify and record. The Stanley Hotel, from mountain resort to haunted legend. The transformation of the Stanley Hotel from an elegant mountain resort into one of the world's most famous haunted destinations represents a remarkable cultural evolution that few historic properties have experienced. A journey from near obscurity to international fame driven by literature, film, television, and the modern fascination with paranormal tourism. By the 1970s, the Stanley had fallen on difficult times. The wealthy tuberculosis patients who had filled its rooms in the early decades had long since been cured by antibiotics. The automobile culture FO. Stanley had helped create now carried tourists past Estes Park to more fashionable destinations, and the Grand Hotel struggled to compete with modern ski resorts and amenity-packed chain hotels. The building was shabby, outdated, hemorrhaging money, and facing a very real possibility of demolition or conversion into condominiums, its elegant ballrooms and sweeping staircases destined to be carved into cheap apartments, its history reduced to a footnote about a tuberculosis sanitarium and an eccentric inventor. Then Stephen King spent one night in room 217, and everything changed in ways that would have seemed impossible to imagine. When The Shining became a bestseller in 1977, and Stanley Kubrick's film adaptation achieved cult classic status in 1980, horror fans and literary enthusiasts began making pilgrimages to Estes Park, seeking the real hotel that had inspired King's terrifying Overlook. Initially, this connection proved somewhat frustrating for both visitors and hotel management. The Kubrick film had not been shot at the Stanley, and the building looked nothing like the sprawling maze-like resort depicted on screen. But gradually, a more sophisticated understanding developed among the hotel's growing fan base. The Stanley was not the Overlook Hotel, but something potentially more interesting. It was the real place with real history and real ghosts that had sparked King's imagination, a genuine haunted location rather than a Hollywood set. This distinction gave the Stanley authenticity that fictional film locations could never possess, and as the hotel began actively promoting its paranormal reputation and its connection to King's novel, a new type of guest began checking in, people who wanted to experience the building not despite its ghosts, but because of them. The cultural momentum accelerated dramatically in the 1990s and 2000s as paranormal investigation became mainstream entertainment rather than fringe pseudoscience. Television shows like Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, and Paranormal Witness featured the Stanley Hotel in special episodes that reached millions of viewers. Their night vision footage of investigators fleeing from room 217. Or capturing EVP recordings in the billiard room, transforming the hotel into a household name among paranormal enthusiasts. These shows presented the Stanley not as a dusty relic or a simple tourist attraction, but as an active paranormal hotspot where genuine supernatural phenomena could be documented with scientific equipment, where ghosts were not metaphorical or historical but present and interactive. The episodes aired repeatedly, spreading the Stanley's reputation globally, attracting visitors from Europe, Asia, and Australia, who added the hotel to bucket lists alongside the Eiffel Tower and Grand Canyon, making it a destination unto itself rather than a convenient stopover for tourists visiting Rocky Mountain National Park. Social media and digital technology amplified this phenomenon exponentially. Guests began posting photographs, videos, and testimonials about their experiences at the Stanley on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and paranormal forums, creating a vast archive of user-generated content that served as free marketing and constant reinforcement of the hotel's haunted reputation. A guest who captured an inexplicable shadow on their iPhone in room 401 could share it with thousands of people instantly, each share and comment expanding the hotel's cultural footprint. Ghost hunting became a participatory activity rather than passive tourism. Visitors brought their own EMF detectors, digital recorders, and infrared cameras, conducting amateur investigations and comparing their findings with other enthusiasts online, creating a global community united by their fascination with the Stanley's ghosts. The hotel's management recognized this shift and adapted brilliantly, offering official ghost tours, paranormal investigation packages, and special events during Halloween where guests could spend the night in the most haunted rooms, transforming the building's supernatural reputation from a quirky footnote into its primary brand identity. Stephen King's own continued involvement cemented the Stanley's legendary status. In 1997, King personally produced a television miniseries adaptation of The Shining that was filmed entirely at the Stanley Hotel, deliberately choosing the real location that had inspired his novel rather than creating artificial sets. The miniseries allowed millions of viewers to see the actual building's interiors: the grand staircase where phantom footsteps echoed, the music room where Flora Stanley's ghost played piano, the corridors where King had wandered during his sleepless night in 1974. King's endorsement carried enormous weight, his willingness to bring his production to the Stanley serving as validation that this was indeed a special place, authentically haunted rather than merely trading on his novel's fame. The hotel appeared in King's later writings. He gave interviews discussing his experiences there, and he maintained a personal connection that fans recognized as genuine, not just commercial exploitation. Stanley's cultural impact extended beyond paranormal tourism into broader American consciousness about historic preservation and adaptive reuse. The hotel's success demonstrated that historic buildings facing obsolescence could reinvent themselves by embracing their unique stories and histories, even, perhaps especially, when those stories involved ghosts and unexplained phenomena. The Stanley became a model for other historic hotels struggling with relevance in the modern era, proving that authenticity, history, and a willingness to engage with supernatural reputation could attract guests in ways that generic renovations and chain hotel amenities never could, transforming potential demolition into international fame and financial viability that ensured F.O. Stanley's magnificent creation would endure for future generations. The Stanley Hotel, where terror became tourism. The Stanley Hotel's deliberate transformation of its haunted reputation into a thriving tourism industry represents one of the most successful examples of paranormal marketing in American history. A carefully orchestrated evolution that turned whispered ghost stories and frightened guests into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that attracts over 100,000 visitors annually to a remote Colorado mountain town. This transformation did not happen accidentally or overnight. It required hotel management to fundamentally reimagine their relationship with the supernatural phenomena that had plagued and fascinated the property for decades. To stop treating ghosts as embarrassing secrets that might frighten away guests and instead embrace them as unique amenities that no competing hotel could possibly offer. The turning point came in the late 90s when management made a bold decision. Rather than downplaying the hauntings, they would actively promote them, creating structured ghost tours and paranormal experiences that allowed curious visitors to safely engage with the hotel's supernatural history without the expense or commitment of actually staying overnight. The night tours, launched in 1990, became the cornerstone of this paranormal tourism empire, offering guests a 2-hour guided journey through the hotel's most haunted locations after dark, when the building took on an entirely different atmosphere than it possessed during daylight hours. Tour guides, trained in both the hotel's factual history and its supernatural folklore, led groups of 20 to 30 people through dimly lit corridors recounting Elizabeth Wilson's explosive encounter in room 217, describing F.O., Stanley's ghostly appearances in the billiard room, explaining the child spirits that played in fourth-floor hallways, and sharing recent paranormal experiences reported by guests and investigators. The tours followed a carefully designed route that maximized atmospheric tension, beginning in the well-lit lobby where guests felt comfortable, gradually ascending through increasingly dim stairwells and corridors, pausing in front of room 217, where the guide would recount the gas explosion in vivid detail, continuing to the infamous fourth floor, where lights were kept deliberately low and the guide would encourage silence so participants could listen for phantom footsteps or children's laughter. The psychological design was brilliant. By the time tour groups reached the darkest, most remote corners of the fourth floor, participants had been primed with stories and atmosphere until every creaking floorboard, every shadow, every distant sound became potentially supernatural. Their imaginations inflamed to the point where they half expected to see ghosts materializing from the wallpaper. What made these tours commercially successful beyond initial expectations was their careful balance between genuine education and theatrical entertainment, providing enough factual history and documented evidence to satisfy serious paranormal enthusiasts, while offering enough dramatic storytelling and atmospheric manipulation to thrill casual tourists seeking a fun scare. Guides carried EMF detectors and digital thermometers, demonstrating the same equipment professional investigators used and sometimes capturing real-time anomalies during tours. Electromagnetic spikes in the billiard room, temperature drops in room 401, that provided participants with the visceral thrill of potentially experiencing actual paranormal activity rather than just hearing stories about it. The tours never promised that guests would definitely see ghosts, which would have been fraudulent and legally problematic, but they created conditions where participants felt they might encounter something supernatural, where the possibility remained tantalizingly open, where every shadow or sound could potentially be evidence of the spirit world manifesting before their eyes. The Stanley expanded beyond basic tours to create increasingly elaborate paranormal experiences targeting different market segments and price points. Standard night tours offered affordable access at $30 to $40 per person, generating steady revenue from casual tourists and families seeking an evening activity during their Colorado vacation. Premium experiences like the Spirit Tour provided smaller groups with extended access, professional ghost hunting equipment, and longer time in the most active locations, appealing to serious paranormal enthusiasts willing to pay $100 or more for enhanced access and investigation opportunities. The ultimate offering, the Night Spirit Tour, allowed small groups to conduct their own paranormal investigations in lockdown sections of the hotel after regular tours ended, providing the same kind of access that television shows and professional investigators received, creating an experience so exclusive and intense that participants paid several $100s for the privilege of spending hours alone in the hotel's most haunted rooms. The hotel transformed its most haunted rooms into premium accommodations commanding rates far higher than comparable non-haunted rooms. A remarkable inversion of traditional hotel economics, where rooms associated with deaths or supernatural activity typically had to be discounted or hidden from guests. Room 217, once a room some guests refused to occupy even when given significant discounts, became so popular it had to be booked months in advance, with guests paying premium rates specifically for the opportunity to sleep in Elizabeth Wilson's haunted domain, hoping to wake with their luggage mysteriously unpacked or their covers tucked around them by invisible hands. The fourth-floor rooms, particularly 401 and 428, similarly commanded premium pricing, their haunted reputations transforming them from liabilities into the hotel's most valuable inventory. The Stanley created special packages combining haunted room stays with ghost tours, paranormal investigation equipment rental, and consultations with the hotel's resident psychic medium, offering comprehensive supernatural experiences that could cost $1,000 or more per night, but attracted a steady stream of customers for whom price was secondary to the possibility of genuine paranormal encounter. Seasonal events amplified this paranormal tourism economy to extraordinary levels. The hotel's Halloween celebrations became legendary, featuring special overnight investigations, costume balls in the grand ballroom, horror film festivals showing The Shining and other classics in the hotel's concert hall, and appearances by celebrity ghost hunters and paranormal researchers, transforming the entire property into a week-long festival of fear that attracted thousands of visitors and generated revenue equivalent to several months of normal operations, compressed into a few extraordinary days when every room was booked, every tour was sold out, and Estes Park's hotels, restaurants, and shops overflowed with tourists drawn by the Stanley's supernatural reputation, proving that ghosts, properly marketed, could sustain not just a single hotel, but an entire mountain community's economy. The Stanley Hotel, between belief and skepticism, more than a century after FO, Stanley broke ground on his mountain dream, and nearly 5 decades after Stephen King spent his fateful night in room 217, the fundamental question about the Stanley Hotel remains unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. Are the spirits that countless witnesses have reported genuinely present, manifestations of consciousness that survived death and chose to remain in this elegant building? Or has the hotel become a kind of collective psychological experiment where human expectation, suggestion, and the power of narrative create experiences that feel supernatural but originate entirely within the minds of those who walk its corridors? This question cuts to the heart of humanity's oldest mysteries about consciousness, death, and the nature of reality itself. And the Stanley Hotel serves as perhaps the perfect laboratory for exploring these questions, because the evidence accumulated over decades refuses to fit neatly into either purely skeptical or purely supernatural explanations, instead occupying an ambiguous middle ground where certainty becomes impossible and both believers and doubters can find support for their positions. The case for genuine paranormal activity rests on several compelling pillars that skeptics struggle to dismiss entirely. First, the sheer consistency of reports across decades and across witnesses with no connection to each other. Housekeepers in the 1920s described the same footsteps on the grand staircase that security guards reported in the 1990s. Guests in the 1950s heard the same piano music in the locked music room that investigators recorded on digital equipment in 2010. All describing phenomena in nearly identical terms despite having no knowledge of previous reports and no opportunity for coordination or suggestion. This consistency across time suggests either a genuine phenomenon that manifests repeatedly in recognizable patterns, or, alternatively, that the hotel's architecture and environment create consistent psychological or acoustic effects that different people interpret similarly. Second, the physical evidence captured by investigators, the EVP recordings of voices that audio analysis confirms are actual vocalizations rather than electronic artifacts, the infrared footage of humanoid heat signatures moving through empty rooms, the electromagnetic field readings that spike and drop without correlation to any electrical source, provides data that skeptics must either explain through unknown natural phenomena or dismiss as fraudulent. Neither of which seems entirely satisfactory given the number of independent investigators who have captured similar evidence using different equipment at different times. The skeptical counterargument, however, carries its own substantial weight and points to well-documented psychological and environmental factors that could explain nearly every reported phenomenon without requiring supernatural explanation. The power of suggestion and expectation cannot be overstated. Once people know they are staying in a haunted hotel, particularly one as famous as the Stanley, their brains become primed to interpret ambiguous sensory input as paranormal, to attribute every creaking floorboard to ghostly footsteps, every shadow to supernatural manifestation, every draft of cold air to spirit presence. Psychological research demonstrates that humans are pattern-seeking creatures who excel at finding meaning and intention in random events, who experience false memories, who perceive things that do not exist when expectation and environment align properly. The Stanley Hotel creates perfect conditions for such experiences. It is an old building where wood settles and contracts, creating sounds that echo through empty hallways. It sits at high altitude where reduced oxygen can create mild hypoxia affecting perception and judgment. It features long corridors and multiple floors where sounds travel unpredictably. appearing to come from impossible locations, and it now carries such intense cultural associations with horror and hauntings that guests arrive already halfway convinced they will experience something supernatural, their expectations creating self-fulfilling prophecies that feel utterly real despite originating in their own minds. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that both explanations contain truth, that the Stanley Hotel operates at the intersection of the supernatural and the psychological, where genuine paranormal phenomena might exist but are amplified, interpreted, and shaped by human consciousness in ways that make separating objective reality from subjective experience essentially impossible. Consider the possibility that traumatic events like Elizabeth Wilson's explosion might indeed leave some kind of energetic imprint on physical space, not necessarily a conscious ghost, but something near like a recording that plays back under certain conditions, interacting with the electromagnetic fields generated by human brains to create experiences that are simultaneously real and imaginary. Objectively present and subjectively constructed, modern physics has revealed that reality at quantum levels operates in ways that defy common sense, where observation affects outcomes and consciousness may play roles we do not yet understand. Perhaps hauntings exist in similar liminal spaces where the boundaries between mind and matter, past and present, living and dead, become permeable in ways that our current scientific frameworks cannot adequately describe or measure. The Stanley Hotel's management has made a choice that sidesteps the question of objective truth in favor of something more pragmatic and perhaps more honest. They acknowledge the reports, document the experiences, provide access for investigation, but make no definitive claims about whether the spirits are real or imaginary, allowing each guest to reach their own conclusions based on their own experiences and beliefs. This approach respects both the skeptics who visit for fun and atmosphere and the believers who come seeking genuine contact with the other side, creating space for mystery rather than trying to eliminate it through forced certainty. In the end, perhaps the question of whether the Stanley's ghosts are real matters less than the fact that for over a century, this magnificent white building perched in the Colorado mountains has served as a place where thousands of people have confronted fundamental questions about consciousness, mortality, and the possibility that death is not the absolute ending we assume it to be, and whether those confrontations arise from actual spirits or from the depths of human imagination may be a distinction without a meaningful difference, because both ultimately reveal truths about the human condition and our eternal fascination with what might lie beyond the veil that separates the living from whatever comes after.